In November of 1974, after a fierce autumn storm swept across the northeastern United States, forest rangers in Winters Mountain County, Vermont, received a troubling report from a pair of hunters. Deep in the woods, 5 miles off the old Route 67, they had stumbled upon the crumbling remains of a stone building. From inside, they claimed, came a strange and unpleasant smell. The structure looked like a long-abandoned chapel, its roof gone, floor partially collapsed, walls smothered in moss and wild vine. There was no door, only an open archway leading into darkness. Inside, the rangers found a jagged hole in the floor, an old trapdoor, its hinges rusted but still intact. From beneath, a thick chemical odor rose, tinged with something sickly sweet. 2 days later, county police arrived, followed closely by federal agents. The trapdoor opened into a cramped cellar. Along one wall stood metal shelving lined with cloudy glass jars, each containing a dark liquid and what looked like silhouettes of something organic floating inside. On the concrete floor sat several wooden crates, their edges blackened by fire. In the farthest corner lay a human skeleton, carefully arranged in a kneeling position, as if in prayer. Forensic analysis later determined the remains belonged to a woman aged between 20 and 25 years old, who had died more than 120 years earlier. How the body had remained in such condition in the damp Vermont soil was never satisfactorily explained. Behind a false brick wall in that cellar, investigators uncovered a metal case containing 19 notebooks. Each was labeled with dates ranging from 1836 to 1854 and bore the initials E.M. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the handwriting was still legible. They appeared to be detailed journals describing the inner workings of a little-known 19th-century religious sect calling itself the Renewed Covenant of Light. The very first paragraph of the earliest notebook read, "Every wound is a step toward cleansing. Every ache is a door to the light. Through the passage, we become what truth intended us to be. Let the flesh burn, let the breath cease, the spirit will continue." Within weeks, rumors spread through the county that authorities had uncovered a mass grave beneath the chapel. The local Winters Mountain Herald ran a headline, "What did the chapel hide? Authorities refuse to comment on disturbing discovery." By December 1974, official information stopped completely. The property was fenced off, and anyone attempting to approach was detained. It wasn't until 2014, when a portion of the case files was declassified, that the public learned the truth. The notebooks told the story of one of the most disturbing and enigmatic religious movements in New England's history, a group that vanished without a trace in the mid-19th century, but may not have truly disappeared at all. The first investigation. The partial declassification of the Winters Mountain case in 2014 revealed just enough to unsettle historians, journalists, and amateur sleuths alike, but not enough to answer the most disturbing questions. What investigators uncovered beneath that ruined chapel in 1974 went far beyond a forgotten burial. According to the surviving documents, federal agents initially treated the site as a potential Prohibition-era hideout or a Civil War smuggling cache. That assumption collapsed within hours of entering the underground network. The cellar beneath the chapel was only the first level. A narrow stone stairwell led down into series of low, arched tunnels, some still shored up with wooden beams that looked decades, if not centuries, old. It was in these deeper rooms that the true nature of the site began to emerge. Investigators catalogued 4 ceremonial chambers, each with a different floor symbol carved into stone, a preparation room containing rusted iron restraints fixed to the walls, large clay vessels sealed with wax, later found to contain a viscous fluid mixed with human bone fragments, and, in the largest chamber, 7 human skeletons arranged in a perfect circle, all facing inward toward a central stone platform. The remains showed signs of healed fractures, shallow carving on the bones, and other evidence suggesting prolonged abuse before death. Among the artifacts recovered were fragments of clothing dated to the 1840s, small hand-carved wooden tokens bearing the same spiral symbol found in the journals, and 2 iron keys wrapped in oilcloth. The keys, according to a 1975 FBI lab report, did not match any locks found at the Winters Mountain site, implying there were others, as yet undiscovered locations connected to the sect. The lead investigator on the federal team, Special Agent Richard Halverson, wrote in a memo marked classified eyes only. The structure, layout, and artifacts suggest long-term occupation by a highly organized group with a consistent symbolic system. Evidence of repeated ritualized activity is undeniable. The journals recovered from the false wall are authentic period documents and appear to be first-hand accounts by a principal figure within the sect. Preliminary analysis indicates that at least some practices described were carried out in these chambers. This was not merely a church. It was a closed system of belief, discipline, and, very likely, homicide. Local reaction was swift and tense. Residents of Winters Mountain County were not eager to be associated with something the press was already whispering about as Vermont's House of Shadows. Some older families remembered stories from their grandparents about strangers passing through the area in the mid-1850s, staying only for a few weeks before disappearing again. One account, taken in 1974 from 87-year-old Ruth Donnelly, described her grandmother's warnings. She used to say, "Don't follow the lanterns in the pines at night. That's the passage people, looking for someone to take." I never knew if she meant it as a joke, but when I was a girl, we all stayed away from the North Ridge after dark. By early 1975, the investigation had reached a standstill. The bones were examined, the artifacts catalogued, the notebooks translated into typed transcripts. But the identities of the dead remained unknown, and every possible lead that might connect the site to living descendants seemed to evaporate. It was only when researchers began to study the journals in detail that a coherent narrative began to emerge, a story reaching back to the 1830s, to the founding of the renewed Covenant of Light, and to 3 brothers whose names had been erased from local memory, but would soon become synonymous with one of the darkest chapters in New England's history. Origins of the renewed Covenant of Light. According to the earliest of the recovered journals, the renewed Covenant of Light was founded in the spring of 1834 in the rural outskirts of Brookhaven Township, Massachusetts, a small settlement surrounded by dense forests and farmland. At the time, the region was in the grip of the so-called Great Awakening, a wave of religious revivalism sweeping across the young United States. The journals attribute the group's creation to three brothers, Elias, Matthew, and Jonas Mercer. While official birth records for the brothers have never been located, census data from 1820 and 1830 suggest they originated from upstate Pennsylvania before moving east. In the journals, the brothers are referred to only by their honorifics, Elder Elias, Deacon Matthew, and Prophet Jonas. Descriptions from the notebooks, as well as later corroboration from fragmentary church records, portray each brother with a distinct role. Elder Elias Mercer, the commanding orator, described as tall, with piercing dark eyes, capable of holding a crowd's attention for hours. Deacon Matthew Mercer, the intellectual, with a background in medicine and scripture, often depicted in ink-stained hands and spectacles, drafting doctrinal texts for the group. Prophet Jonas, the youngest and the most unsettling, claimed to receive visions from the true light during prolonged trances. Witnesses later described his pale blue eyes rolling back as he whispered in an intelligible tongue. In late 1834, the brothers purchased a wooded parcel of land just outside Brookhaven and began constructing a building they called the Sanctuary of the True Light. Unlike the white clapboard meeting houses common to New England, the sanctuary was built of dark granite quarried from nearby hills. Its main chamber was octagonal, with no windows, illuminated only by lanterns hung from a high, narrow steeple. The journals record the first public gathering on December 9, 1834. Elder Elias addressed the assembled townspeople. "The churches of this land have grown soft. They preach comfort where there must be trial. We are called to restore the path, to burn away the flesh's corruption until the soul shines pure. This will be the furnace in which the true light tempers his people." At first, the Mercers' teaching seemed only an austere variation on familiar Christian revivalism. They spoke of humility, the rejection of worldly possessions, and the need for spiritual refinement through personal hardship. But within weeks, subtle differences emerged. Membership in the covenant required a private interview with Prophet Jonas. New initiates were encouraged to give up their homes and possessions, moving into small communal dwellings around the sanctuary. Outsiders noted the congregation's growing isolation and the unusual practice of gathering in the sanctuary for all-night vigils of purification, where members would kneel motionless in the unheated chamber, chanting softly until dawn. The first journal entries from early 1835 describe the passage, a term not yet defined in detail, but spoken of as the highest honor within the covenant. In a letter fragment found in the archives of the Brookhaven Historical Society, an anonymous local wrote, "They speak of it as crossing a threshold. The few chosen for it are not seen again in the town, but their names are read aloud at gatherings, and the people cheer as though they have gone to heaven itself." Over the next 2 years, the covenant grew steadily, drawing the poor seeking belonging, the bereaved seeking meaning, and even a few rich patrons curious about its intense rituals. By the winter of 1836, the first full account of a passage would be recorded in the journals, and it would mark the point where the sect's history turned from strange to deadly. The first passage. The earliest detailed account of what the covenant called the passage comes from a journal entry dated December 21, 1836, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. The entry is written in the hand of Elder Elias, its tone both solemn and unnervingly clinical. The light has spoken through the prophet. 3 souls are chosen. Their burden shall be unmade, their spirit drawn upward. This night shall be remembered as the first passage, and the covenant will know its true path. The 3 selected members, identified only as Sarah M., Michael C., and Rebecca Y., had joined the covenant less than a year earlier. According to the journals, each had been prepared through weeks of fasting, night vigils, and periods of sensory isolation in a darkened cell beneath the sanctuary. At sunset, the entire congregation, about 90 members at the time, was summoned to the main chamber. No candles were lit at first. Only a single iron lantern glowed on the central stone platform. Gradually, more lanterns were brought forward, placed at 8 points around the platform in the shape of a spiral. From the accounts, Prophet Jonas entered last. Witnesses in later depositions described him as pale, unsteady on his feet, his eyes rolled upward as if in a trance. He began to speak in what the journals describe as the language of the light, a series of guttural and high-pitched sounds, indecipherable, yet delivered with hypnotic intensity. The 3 chosen were brought forward by Deacon Matthew, stripped to their undergarments despite the winter cold, and bound to wooden frames shaped like inverted crosses. Elder Elias addressed the congregation. "The world honors the flesh. We reverse it. We strip the vessel until the spirit alone remains." What followed was a series of ordeals described in the journals as the 7 trials. These included trial of air, wet cloths laid over the face while water was poured slowly, inducing the sensation of drowning; trial of earth, soil from the sanctuary grounds packed tightly around the body, leaving only the head exposed; trial of flame, heated iron pressed to the skin in specific, deliberate patterns; trial of water, repeated submersion in near-freezing water until consciousness failed. The final 3 trials are recorded only in fragments, the handwriting uneven and the ink blotched, as though Elias himself faltered while writing. Surviving descriptions suggest a combination of prolonged suspension, constriction of the chest, and what appears to be controlled bloodletting. Throughout the ordeal, the congregation was instructed to chant in unison, "Through pain, purity; through purity, light." By dawn, all 3 chosen members were barely alive. Prophet Jonas placed his hands on each of their heads, whispering in the language of the light. The journals claim that each convulsed violently before falling still. All 3 were declared ascended before the congregation. Instead of burial, their bodies were placed in a newly dug chamber beneath the sanctuary, laid on stone slabs. Members were encouraged to visit the bodies and pray for their own eventual passage. The first passage, far from repelling the congregation, solidified the Mercer brothers' control. The journal closes with a chilling note. "They have seen the light's true work. There is nothing they will not do for it now." Following the first passage of 1836, the renewed covenant of light entered what the journals describe as its season of harvest. Membership nearly doubled in less than 2 years, drawing not only the rural poor of Brookhaven Township, but also merchants, tradesmen, and even minor landowners from neighboring counties. From the outside, the covenant appeared industrious and self-sufficient. They expanded their land holdings, built additional dwellings, and established workshops producing candles, textiles, and finely crafted wooden furniture, items sold in nearby towns under the label "Made in the Light." Profits flowed into the sanctuary, but so too did property deeds, as new members were persuaded to surrender the weight of ownership for the sake of spiritual elevation. Inside the covenant's inner circle, however, the journals show a steady escalation of control. Attendance at nightly vigils became mandatory. Food was rationed according to a member's readiness for the light. Those deemed spiritually advanced were given less, as depriving was framed as a mark of purity. Conversations with outsiders were discouraged, and travel beyond the covenant's lands required Elder Elias' personal permission. The most devout, called vessels of the light, were invited to undergo deep purification. The early stages resembled ascetic monastic practice, fasting, cold water immersion, long periods of silent prayer. But over time, the measures became more extreme: binding of limbs during meditation, prolonged isolation in lightless rooms, and exposure to near-freezing temperatures for hours at a time. By 1838, according to the records, passages were being conducted quarterly. The selection process became a public event. During Sunday gatherings, Prophet Jonas would scan the crowd with a fixed gaze, sometimes stopping mid-sermon to point at a member. That person's name would be recorded in a leather-bound ledger by Deacon Matthew, and from that day forward they were treated with both reverence and distance. One particularly revealing letter preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Archive comes from a former member named Abigail Rhodes, who escaped in 1839. At first, we thought the chosen were blessed, but once marked for passage, they were not the same. They slept apart, ate apart, and spoke little. Some cried quietly at night. Others seemed almost eager. We were told not to question the light's choice, but in my heart I knew it was a death sentence. The journals also document a change in the nature of the trials. While the first passage emphasized symbolic ordeals, earth, water, flame, the later rituals grew more calculated. Deacon Matthew's notes show precise measurements of heartbeat, breathing, and blood loss, alongside diagrams of the body marked with symbols. In one margin he wrote, "Pain is the chisel, the vessel is the stone. Only through carving can the light enter fully." By the early 1940s, rumors had begun to leak into nearby towns. Families who lost relatives to the covenant were given evasive explanations. They have passed into the light, or they walk in places you cannot see yet. When local authorities inquired, they were met with polite but firm denials. The sanctuary, they were told, was a private house of worship, and all within its walls was protected under the freedom of religion. The Mercer brothers had achieved what few such groups could: complete domination over their followers, a growing economic base, and near total immunity from inside interference. But the journals hint at an ambition that reached far beyond Brookhaven. In a December 1841 entry, Elder Elias wrote, "The light has shown us the map. This is only the first beacon. Others will rise in other lands. The network will grow unseen until the whole earth is alight." That vision would soon lead to a darker, more secretive phase in the covenant's history, one that centered not in the sanctuary, but deep beneath it. The inner chambers. Until the partial declassification in 2014, little was known about what lay beneath the sanctuary of the true light. The 1974 excavation revealed only fragments of a much larger subterranean complex, but the recovered journals, especially those dated 1839 to 1845, describe the underground network in unsettling detail. Construction of the chambers began in the spring of 1839, ostensibly as a cellar expansion for storing grain and preserving goods. In reality, the work was done entirely by the covenant's most devoted vessels, chosen for their obedience and silence. No outside laborers were ever employed, and the entrances were concealed beneath trapdoors inside the sanctuary itself. According to the journals, there were at least 7 principal chambers, each with a specific function in the covenant's ritual system. The Chamber of Preparation, a small windowless room where candidates for the passage were kept in isolation for days or weeks before their ordeal. Journals described cleansing through fasting, silence, and controlled deprivation of light. The Chamber of Trials, equipped with heavy iron restraints fixed to the walls, along with wooden platforms stained dark from years of use. Implements for the 7 trials were kept here, each carefully cleaned and oiled after ceremonies. The Chamber of Passage was the central ritual space, dominated by a raised stone dais carved with the spiral symbol. The floor was inlaid with dark granite lines radiating outward like spokes from the dais. Lantern niches in the walls created shifting, almost hypnotic shadows. The Chamber of Remains, referred to in the journals as the Garden of Light, here the bodies of those who had undergone the passage were arranged in seated or kneeling positions, dressed in ceremonial robes, their faces painted with white ash. Some were partially mummified, others were reduced to skeletal form, the bones bound with wire to maintain posture. The Chamber of Reflection was used for the indoctrination of newer members. Survivors' testimonies indicate they were brought here blindfolded, led among the preserved dead, and told that these were the saints of the light who watched over the covenant. The Chamber of Records was where Deacon Matthew kept his ledgers and anatomical notes. This room was lined with shelves containing jars, boxes of dried herbs, and rolls of parchment covered in intricate diagrams of the human body, overlaid with symbols. The Chamber of Ashes was a low, narrow space with a single brick hearth. Here, possessions of the departed were burned, and the ashes collected into clay urns bearing only the spiral mark. The journals note that access to the deeper chambers was restricted to the Mercer brothers and a handful of trusted inner circle members. Even among the vessels, many never saw more than the preparation and trials chambers. An entry from April 1943, written by Elder Elias, reveals the intended purpose of the entire complex. These halls are the womb of the new light. In them the vessel is emptied, the spirit is filled, and the remains are set as a testament. Each stone, each arch bears witness to the covenant between pain and transcendence. When federal investigators explored the ruins in 1974, they confirmed the existence of several of these chambers, although many had been deliberately collapsed or flooded. The Chamber of Remains, however, matched the journal descriptions almost exactly. Among the skeletons recovered there, at least 12 bore signs of deliberate modification: missing ribs, carved bone markings, and in some cases small metal rods embedded in the spine. It was here, in the Garden of Light, that the covenant's blend of ritual devotion and anatomical experimentation became impossible to deny. By the mid-1840s, the renewed covenant of light had reached its peak in both numbers and influence. The journals from this period, particularly those penned by Deacon Matthew, show a striking shift in tone. What began as theological reflections on purification and transcendence had evolved into something colder, more methodical. The language became that of an experimenter, not a preacher. Passages, once rare and shrouded in mystery, were now scheduled with regularity. Every solstice, every equinox, and sometimes on dates of special significance revealed by Prophet Jonas. The selection process became almost theatrical. The congregation assembled in the sanctuary, Jonas scanning the crowd with his glassy upward-rolled eyes before calling a name. Applause followed, but survivors later testified that the chosen often wept or went pale on hearing their fate. The 7 trials themselves were refined, made more precise in both duration and intensity. Deacon Matthew's ledgers recorded heart rates, breathing patterns, and recovery times after each stage of the ordeal. Marginal notes in his hand read, "Subject maintained consciousness for 47 minutes after final restriction. Remarkable endurance. Adjust technique for next selection." Other entries made clear that not all passages ended with immediate death. In some cases, the chosen lingered for days or even weeks in a weakened state, housed in a locked room within the underground chambers where additional procedures were carried out. The journals never name these procedures outright, but surviving diagrams show incisions, skeletal modifications, and the insertion of slender iron rods along the spine. The number of victims rose sharply. According to Deacon Matthew's own tallies, there were 5 passages in 1838. By 1844, there were over 20, claiming as many as 3 lives each. That same year, the Covenant began quietly selling specimens to medical colleges in Boston, Albany, and even Philadelphia. In a letter to an unnamed recipient, preserved in the FBI's 1974 evidence inventory, Matthew wrote, "The quality of the material will exceed your expectations. Preparation is as discussed, no visible trauma, preservation assured." This trade served 3 purposes. It disposed of bodies without local burial, brought in significant funds, and allowed Matthew to exchange anatomical knowledge with sympathetic physicians. Some of these contacts were likely aware of the illicit source of the specimens, though no institution was ever formally charged. Meanwhile, Prophet Jonas's mental state deteriorated. Journals from 1845 describe increasingly erratic visions of shapes moving in the walls, of the light speaking through the bones of the departed. Yet his influence over the congregation only deepened. Several accounts describe Jonas selecting not just adults, but children for the passage, claiming their innocence made them the purest vessels. By this time, the covenant's activities could no longer be hidden entirely. Families in neighboring towns whispered of relatives who had gone to the light and never returned. A blacksmith from a nearby village reported seeing a cart leaving the sanctuary at dawn, covered by canvas, but dripping water, the wheels cutting deep ruts into the mud. Still, the Mercer brothers faced no real interference. They were well respected in certain circles, their workshops providing high-quality goods, their public sermons carefully framed as moral and charitable. Within their walled enclave, however, the covenant had become a self-contained system of indoctrination, ritual killing, and clandestine medical trade. In an 1846 entry, Elder Elias wrote, "The light demands more. The beacons will spread. This vessel of Brookhaven will not be the last." It was a promise and a warning that the horrors of the sanctuary were about to extend far beyond the forests of Massachusetts. Rumors and first suspicion. By late 1846, the Covenant's isolation had become both its strength and its liability. The Mercer brothers had succeeded in creating a closed community, almost entirely self-reliant, shielded by religious freedom and a loyal inner circle. But the very secrecy that protected them began to draw attention. In Brookhaven and the surrounding towns, people whispered about strange happenings. Lantern lights moving through the pines at midnight in areas far from any road. Long, low chants drifting across the fields on windless nights. Wagons departing the sanctuary under heavy canvas, escorted by 2 or more covenant members carrying lanterns. At first, these were dismissed as harmless oddities of a devout sect. But when disappearances began to overlap with these sightings, concern grew. Between 1845 and 1847, at least 9 individuals were reported missing in the county: laborers, widows, and 2 teenage boys from neighboring farms. In each case, the last confirmed sighting placed them within walking distance of the Covenant's lands. One of the earliest recorded complaints came from Thomas Greaves, a farmer whose sister, Ruth, had joined the Covenant in 1844. In a sworn statement taken years later, he recalled, "When I came to see her, she looked thin, pale, but smiled like nothing was wrong. She told me she'd been chosen for something wonderful. 3 weeks later, I came back, and they told me she'd passed into the light. I asked to see her, but Elder Elias said her body had been sanctified and could not be touched by the unprepared. That's when I knew something was wrong." Local constable records from 1847 show at least 2 attempts to enter the Covenant grounds under official authority, both of which failed. On each occasion, the Mercers cited religious rights and private property laws, offering polite but firm refusals. They even invited constables to attend a public service and offered design to appear transparent, though these events were heavily staged and revealed nothing of the underground chambers. Still, the rumors spread. A tavern owner in a neighboring village claimed a traveling peddler told him of seeing rooms full of sitting corpses beneath the sanctuary. A school teacher reported overhearing 2 Covenant members discussing a child who would soon see the light. It was a chance encounter, however, that brought the first real break in the wall of secrecy. In the spring of 1848, Abigail Rhodes, the same woman whose letter had hinted at the true nature of the passage, fled the Covenant under cover of night. Malnourished and frightened, she found refuge with distant relatives in Boston, where she told them about the trials, the chanting, and the bodies kept as saints. Her relatives urged her to go to the authorities, but fearing disbelief and retaliation, she refused. Instead, Rhodes's story circulated privately among Boston's abolitionist and reformist circles. There, it caught the attention of a man who would eventually become pivotal to the Covenant's downfall, Postal Inspector Samuel Harrow. Though his position had nothing to do with criminal investigations, Harrow's work tracking suspicious correspondence would soon intersect with the Covenant in ways no one could have predicted. By 1849, Harrow had begun compiling his own quiet file on the renewed covenant of light, noting irregularities in financial transactions and the unusual frequency of letters to certain medical institutions. But without hard evidence, he could do little more than watch and wait for the opportunity to move. That opportunity would come not from Brookhaven itself, but from a remote property nearly 40 miles away, purchased quietly by an associate of the Mercer brothers in 1840. The farm facility. The existence of what investigators would later call the farm facility remained unknown to the public until the partial release of federal documents in 2014. In fact, even in the surviving Mercer journals, references to it are sparse, always coded, never named directly. The location was simply referred to as the Outer Garden. Property records eventually revealed that in 1840, a 120-acre tract of remote farmland in the hills west of Ashford, Massachusetts, was purchased under the name of one Henry Phelps. Phelps, however, never lived there, and no census record places him in the county. Multiple historians now believe he was either a fabricated identity or a loyal Covenant member acting as a front for the Mercers. The farm was a perfect choice for secrecy. Miles from the nearest settlement, surrounded by dense woodland, and accessible only by a narrow, unmaintained wagon road. The main house was a modest two-story clapboard structure, but behind it stood two large barns and several outbuildings. One of those barns, investigators later discovered, concealed a basement twice the size of the structure above it. According to testimony from Samuel Parsons, a former Covenant accountant who fled in 1849, the farm served a dual purpose. Officially, it was a place for advanced meditation for select vessels, chosen members sent there for months at a time to deepen their devotion. Unofficially, it was the site of the Covenant's most sustained and deliberate experiments. Parsons described seeing deliveries of surgical instruments, crates of chemicals, and even specialized restraints delivered under cover of darkness. On at least 2 occasions, he noted wagons arriving from Brookhaven carrying individuals under heavy blankets, breathing but unmoving. None of those individuals, Parsons testified, were ever seen leaving the farm alive. What made the farm distinct from the sanctuary's underground chambers was the duration of the suffering. Victims here were not subjected to the 7 trials in the single night. Instead, procedures were drawn out over days or weeks, meticulously recorded in ledgers kept by Deacon Matthew. Surviving excerpts from these ledgers, found in 1974, hidden inside a sealed clay urn, detailed body temperature readings, reactions to various chemical compounds, and notes on the effect of sustained pain on respiration. The most chilling discovery at the farm came from a separate building behind the main barn. Smaller in scale, it was fitted with narrow cells, each no larger than a pantry. The doors had sliding panels at eye level, and inside each cell were iron rings bolted to the floor and walls. The measurements and restraint placements suggested they had been designed specifically for children. Ledger entries confirm at least 37 minors, ranging in age from 4 to 16, were held at the farm between 1840 and 1850. The journals described them as pure vessels, and in one particularly disturbing line, Elder Elias wrote, "The light speaks most clearly through the unclouded. The young vessel sings the truest note when the flesh is thinned." When federal agents finally entered the farm in 1851, after the Covenant's collapse, they found most of the underground rooms burned and many records destroyed. But what remained was enough to confirm that the Mercer brothers' ambitions had gone far beyond ritual purification. They had created an isolated laboratory for systematic human experimentation, conducted under the cloak of religious ceremony. The public would not learn the full details for another century. In the 19th century, newspapers hinted at unspeakable crimes and the profanation of innocence, but specifics were omitted in deference to Victorian sensibilities. Even now, much of the photographic evidence from the farm remains sealed in federal archives. The farm facility. The existence of what investigators would later call the farm facility remained unknown to the public until the partial release of federal documents in 2014. In fact, even in the surviving Mercer journals, references to it are sparse, always coded, never named directly. The location was simply referred to as the Outer Garden. Property records eventually revealed that in 1840, a 120-acre tract of remote farmland in the hills west of Ashford, Massachusetts, was purchased under the name of one Henry Phelps. Phelps, however, never lived there, and no census record places him in the county. Multiple historians now believe he was either a fabricated identity or a loyal Covenant member acting as a front for the Mercers. The farm was a perfect choice for secrecy. Miles from the nearest settlement, surrounded by dense woodland, and accessible only by a narrow, unmaintained wagon road. The main house was a modest two-story clapboard structure, but behind it stood two large barns and several outbuildings. One of those barns, investigators later discovered, concealed a basement twice the size of the structure above it. According to testimony from Samuel Parsons, a former Covenant accountant who fled in 1849, the farm served a dual purpose. Officially, it was a place for advanced meditation for select vessels, chosen members sent there for months at a time to deepen their devotion. Unofficially, it was the site of the Covenant's most sustained and deliberate experiments. Parsons described seeing deliveries of surgical instruments, crates of chemicals, and even specialized restraints delivered under cover of darkness. On at least 2 occasions, he noted wagons arriving from Brookhaven carrying individuals under heavy blankets, breathing but unmoving. None of those individuals, Parsons testified, were ever seen leaving the farm alive. What made the farm distinct from the sanctuary's underground chambers was the duration of the suffering. Victims here were not subjected to the 7 trials in the single night. Instead, procedures were drawn out over days or weeks, meticulously recorded in ledgers kept by Deacon Matthew. Surviving excerpts from these ledgers, found in 1974, hidden inside a sealed clay urn, detailed body temperature readings, reactions to various chemical compounds, and notes on the effect of sustained pain on respiration. The most chilling discovery at the farm came from a separate building behind the main barn. Smaller in scale, it was fitted with narrow cells, each no larger than a pantry. The doors had sliding panels at eye level, and inside each cell were iron rings bolted to the floor and walls. The measurements and restraint placements suggested they had been designed specifically for children. Ledger entries confirm at least 37 minors, ranging in age from 4 to 16, were held at the farm between 1840 and 1850. The journals described them as pure vessels, and in one particularly disturbing line, Elder Elias wrote, "The light speaks most clearly through the unclouded. The young vessel sings the truest note when the flesh is thinned." When federal agents finally entered the farm in 1851, after the Covenant's collapse, they found most of the underground rooms burned and many records destroyed. But what remained was enough to confirm that the Mercer brothers' ambitions had gone far beyond ritual purification. They had created an isolated laboratory for systematic human experimentation, conducted under the cloak of religious ceremony. The public would not learn the full details for another century. In the 19th century, newspapers hinted at unspeakable crimes and the profanation of innocence, but specifics were omitted in deference to Victorian sensibilities. Even now, much of the photographic evidence from the farm remains sealed in federal archives. The trial. The trial of Elder Elias and Deacon Matthew Mercer began on October 6, 1851, in the Worcester County Courthouse. From the moment the proceedings opened, the case drew massive public attention. Newspapers from Boston, New York, and even London sent correspondents, eager to report on what the press was already calling the Brookhaven atrocities. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Charles Whitcomb, laid out a case built on 3 pillars: the recovered remains, over 40 bodies, found beneath the sanctuary and at the farm facility, many showing clear signs of restraint and mutilation; the surviving ledgers, anatomical notes, names of chosen members, and detailed descriptions of the 7 trials; eyewitness testimony from escaped members like Abigail Rhodes and Samuel Parsons, who described in vivid detail the rituals and the Mercer brothers' absolute control over the covenant. Whitcomb's opening statement was blunt. These men hid behind Scripture to commit acts of cruelty so calculated, so sustained, that they surpass the darkest imaginings of our criminal annals. The dead cannot speak for themselves, but the stones of Brookhaven will speak for them. The defense, led by attorney Nathaniel Greer, argued that the covenant's practices were protected as religious rituals under the First Amendment. He claimed that the dead had given consent to the passage as a voluntary act of faith, and that the prosecution's witnesses were either disgruntled former members or outsiders with no understanding of the covenant's spiritual framework. Elder Elias himself took the stand on the 9th day of the trial. Dressed in plain black, with his long hair tied back, he spoke calmly and eloquently. When asked directly if he had ordered the deaths of covenant members, he replied, "Death is a word for those who have not seen the light. We did not kill, we transformed. The vessel perishes, yes, but what is clay compared to the eternal Spirit? They came to us willingly, and they ascended willingly." The courtroom atmosphere shifted whenever he spoke. Reporters noted that several attendees, believed to be remaining covenant loyalists, nodded along with his words, as if still under his sway. Deacon Matthew, by contrast, remained silent throughout the proceedings, speaking only to confirm his name and residence. The prosecution painted him as the technician of the covenant's horrors, the one who refined the 7 trials and recorded their effects with chilling detachment. Perhaps the most damning testimony came from Dr. Alistair Penn, a Boston physician who admitted under oath to purchasing preserved anatomical specimens from the covenant through intermediaries. Though he insisted he did not know their exact origin, the physical descriptions in his correspondence matched several of the bodies found at the farm facility. After 6 weeks, the jury found both brothers guilty on multiple counts of murder, abuse of a corpse, and conspiracy to defraud. The sentence was death by hanging, scheduled for December 29, 1851. Yet the executions would never take place. On the morning of December 18, 11 days before the scheduled hangings, the Mercer brothers vanished from their cells. The only clue was a single spiral symbol drawn in ash on the wall between their cells. Despite a massive search, they were never found. The official theory was that remaining Covenant loyalists had orchestrated their escape, possibly spiriting them away to Canada, but rumors persisted that they had not fled at all, that a hidden section of the courthouse itself, accessible through long forgotten tunnels, had taken them into the light forever. With the leaders gone, the Covenant's remnants scattered, but the story was far from over. The fire and disappearance. The escape of Elder Elias and Deacon Matthew Mercer on December 18, 1851, sent shockwaves through New England. Authorities launched immediate manhunts across Massachusetts, Vermont, and upstate New York, with rewards posted in every major town. Yet despite dozens of reported sightings, no confirmed trace of the brothers ever surfaced. In the weeks that followed, something even stranger began to happen. Covenant properties, both known and suspected, were systematically destroyed by fire. The first blaze erupted at the farm facility near Ashford. Witnesses described seeing figures moving in the tree line before the building went up in flames. By the time local militia arrived, the barn, the underground chambers, and every outbuilding had been reduced to smoldering ruins. Over the next month, at least 4 additional structures tied to the Covenant burned under suspicious circumstances. A warehouse in Worcester where confiscated Covenant artifacts were being stored. A small farmhouse outside Brookhaven, believed to have housed Loyalist families. A riverside storage shed in Albany, connected to shipments traced to Deacon Matthew. And most notably, the remaining standing sections of the sanctuary itself. Each fire was accompanied by the same calling card, a spiral symbol painted in ash on a nearby wall or tree. Investigators quickly suspected that remaining Covenant loyalists were responsible, working to erase evidence and destroy anything that could connect the group to further crimes. However, some witnesses claimed the fires were accompanied by eerie chanting in the distance, or by the sight of hooded figures moving silently through the snow. One account from a Brookhaven night watchman, recorded in early January 1852, stood out. "I saw them in the road, 5 or 6 of them, walking in single file. Each carried a lantern, but the light was strange, flickering like it came from inside the glass, rather than a flame. They turned down toward the sanctuary, and though I followed, the road was empty when I got there. No footprints, no sound, nothing." By the end of winter, the Covenant as an organized body had effectively ceased to exist. Many rank-and-file members either fled the region or tried to reintegrate quietly into society. A few were arrested on charges of aiding the Mercers, but most cases collapsed for lack of evidence. Yet the disappearances did not stop entirely. Between 1852 and 1855, isolated reports surfaced of individuals vanishing in rural parts of New England, often preceded by sightings of lantern light in wooded areas. In several of these cases, spiral symbols were found carved into tree bark or etched into nearby stones. Theories about the Mercers' fate multiplied. That they had escaped to Canada and re-established the covenant under a new name. That they had been smuggled aboard a merchant vessel bound for Europe. Or, in the view of the most devoted former members, that they had ascended in a final passage, vanishing bodily into the light. Officially, the case was closed in 1860, when the state declared both brothers legally dead. Unofficially, the legend of the renewed covenant of light had only just begun to root itself in New England folklore. Lingering shadows. Though the state declared the Mercer brothers dead in 1860, the renewed covenant of light never truly disappeared. Instead, it slipped into something harder to track, half folklore, half conspiracy. A story retold in hushed tones around hearths and taverns across New England. Folklorists collecting oral histories in the late 19th century recorded numerous accounts of strange lights moving through the forests on moonless nights. In some versions, the lights were described as lanterns, in others as cold fires that gave off no heat. Almost invariably, claimed witnesses, the lights led towards abandoned farmhouses, crumbling mills, or, most disturbingly, towards the ruins of the sanctuary itself. The spiral symbol became a recurring motif in rural graffiti. Carved into bridge timbers, scratched into gravestones, or marked in ash on barn doors, it appeared so often that some towns began quietly removing or painting over the signs without public explanation. Police blotters from the 1870s contain scattered references to ritual markings at the sites of unexplained disappearances. In 1873, for example, a woodsman named Albert Crane vanished near the Quabbin Hills. His axe and satchel were found leaning against a tree, but the snow beneath them was undisturbed, no footprints leading away. On the trunk above the items was a spiral burned into the bark with some form of heated iron. There were also rumors of second congregations forming in isolated pockets, small, tight-knit groups that met in barns or basements, claiming spiritual lineage to the covenant. One such group was reportedly broken up in Maine in 1884, after neighbors heard prolonged chanting and alerted authorities. Inside the meeting space, police found a crude altar and 7 chairs arranged in a circle around it. Even in Boston, far from the forests of Brookhaven, stories persisted. Medical students whispered about Mercer specimens still preserved in certain anatomy collections, specimens never officially catalogued, but identifiable by spiral carvings on the bone. Whether these were genuine relics of the covenant or later fabrications remains uncertain. By the early 20th century, the renewed covenant of light had become more legend than fact. Newspapers occasionally revived the story during slow news cycles, especially around the anniversaries of the Mercers' arrest or disappearance. Some writers treated it as a cautionary tale about religious fanaticism, others as a piece of macabre entertainment. But in certain rural towns, the legend retained a sharper edge. In interviews conducted by a WPA folklore project in the 1930s, older residents still warned children not to follow strange lights in the woods and not to speak the names of the Mercer brothers after sundown. One informant, then in her 80s, told researchers, "They say the light don't die, it waits. If you see the spiral, you're already marked. Best keep walking and don't look back." Theories and modern echoes. In the modern era, the story of the renewed covenant of light has shifted from local folklore to a subject of fascination for historians, occult researchers, and urban explorers. The partial declassification of federal files in 2014, including photographs of the underground chambers and fragments of the Mercer journals, rekindled public interest. Almost immediately, online forums began dissecting every available document, comparing old maps to satellite imagery, and swapping theories about what really happened to the Mercer brothers. Three primary schools of thought emerged. The survival theory. Believers in this version claim the Mercers escaped to another region, possibly Canada or the Pacific Northwest, and continued their work under a different name. Proponents point to a series of disappearances in British Columbia in the 1860s, some involving ritual markings similar to the Brookhaven spiral. The underground network theory holds that the covenant was never a single group, but part of a wider decentralized movement. In this view, the Mercers were merely one beacon in a hidden network of like-minded sects, each operating independently but sharing the same symbols and doctrines. Supporters of this theory cite the Maine Second Congregation raid in 1884 as evidence. The ascension theory, the most fringe interpretation, insists that the Mercer brothers genuinely believed and achieved a supernatural transformation. Followers of this view point to Jonas Mercer's cryptic sermons and to the lack of concrete evidence after their escape, suggesting they may have disappeared through means beyond ordinary explanation. The legend has also intersected with modern disappearances. Since 1980, at least 11 hikers have gone missing within a 20-mile radius of the Brookhaven sanctuary ruins. While most are attributed to accidents or exposure, two cases stand out. Both victims were experienced outdoorsmen. Both vanished in clear weather, and in each case, searchers found a spiral carved into a nearby tree. Urban explorers have documented their own unsettling encounters while visiting the ruins. In 2009, a group filming in the collapsed tunnels reported hearing faint chanting and seeing what they described as a lantern's glow retreating deeper into an inaccessible section. The footage uploaded to YouTube is inconclusive, but it remains one of the most watched videos related to the covenant. In the years since the files were unsealed, a small but vocal group of researchers has begun pushing for a full excavation of the sanctuary site. They argue that significant portions of the underground network remain untouched, potentially preserving records, artifacts, and even bodies. Opponents, including local historical societies, warned that disturbing the site risks both public safety and the loss of what little structural integrity the tunnels still have. Meanwhile, the spiral symbol has taken on a life of its own. It appears in graffiti from Boston to Portland, in anonymous internet avatars, and even carved into the desks of certain high schools in Worcester County. Whether these are genuine acts of devotion, pranks, or something darker is a matter of debate. In the end, the renewed covenant of light occupies a unique space between documented history and living myth. There is enough verifiable evidence to confirm the group's existence and their crimes, yet so many unanswered questions remain that the legend continues to grow generation after generation. As Elder Elias once wrote in his journal, "The light is not bound by place or time. It walks in shadow until it is called, and when it is called, it will burn." Conclusion. The story of the renewed covenant of light resists closure. Every attempt to neatly conclude its history is undermined by gaps in the record, missing witnesses, and the sheer persistence of its symbols in places and times far removed from Brookhaven. What can be stated with certainty is this. Between roughly 1832 and 1851, the Covenant was an active, organized sect led by the Mercer brothers. Dozens, possibly hundreds of members underwent the passage, a ritualized process of torture and death framed as spiritual transcendence. The group operated not only from the sanctuary in Brookhaven, but also from at least one other major site, the farm facility, dedicated to prolonged experimentation on both adults and children. The group sustained itself economically through manufacturing, property acquisition, and the sale of human remains to medical institutions. The collapse of the covenant was sudden but incomplete. The arrest and trial of Elder Elias and Deacon Matthew ended in their unexplained escape, followed by a systematic destruction of physical evidence. Despite later searches, neither brother was ever found, and their ultimate fate remains unknown. More troubling is the persistence of the spiral symbol and of covenant-style disappearances into the modern era. Whether this reflects genuine survival of the group, copycat activity, or a cultural echo amplified by folklore is impossible to determine. In interviews conducted in 2015 as part of a documentary project, descendants of Brookhaven residents offered conflicting perspectives. Some insisted the covenant was long gone, a nightmare buried in the past. Others claimed to have seen lantern light in the woods or heard chanting on still nights. One man, whose great-grandfather had been a constable during the 1851 investigation, spoke on camera but refused to show his face. "They're not gone. They just wait. And if you go looking for them, they'll know you before you ever see them." Today, the ruins of the sanctuary are off-limits, fenced and posted with warning signs. The official reason is public safety, unstable ground, risk of collapse, but those who have stood at the perimeter describe a feeling of being watched, even in daylight. A few have claimed to have found fresh spirals carved into trees nearby. The Covenant's legacy is one of absence, leaders who vanished, records that burned, chambers that collapsed, and voices silenced. Yet in that absence lies its power. What remains unknown allows the imagination to fill in the blanks, making the story not just history, but a living myth. As the last page of Elder Elias's recovered journal reads, "When the light is needed, it will return. When the vessel is ready, it will open. Nothing ends, everything ascends."